Chapter 1, The Exit. Joe Thompson had always believed endings should be clean. No theatrics, no begging, no dragging a corpse of a marriage through months of misery. So when his wife of 3.5 years sat across from him at their kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of a coffee mug like it held the courage she needed, Joe already knew what was coming. "I think," she began, voice trembling just enough to sound rehearsed. "I think we need to talk." Joe didn't flinch. He'd seen this storm gathering for months, the late-night texts from her divorced friends, the sudden girls' weekends, the way her laughter had started sounding like someone else's echo. 3 divorces in her inner circle in 18 months. It was like watching dominoes fall in slow motion, and Joe had been standing at the end of the line. He slid a manila envelope across the table. "Sign these." Her eyes widened. What is this?" "Divorce papers," Joe said, his tone calm, almost bored. "You're right. We need to talk. But let's make it efficient." She stared at him, mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. You already had these drawn up?" Joe leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "You've been auditioning for Single Life for months. I figured I'd save us both the drama." Her cheeks flushed, indignation sparking like static. "You're not even going to fight for this?" He laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Fight for what? 3 years of my life I can't get back? No thanks." Her lips parted, ready to protest, but Joe cut her off with a raised hand. "Sign the papers, pack your things, and thanks for wasting my time." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. She signed. She left, and Joe didn't look back. 10 months later, she tried. Showed up at his apartment with tears in her eyes and apologies spilling like cheap wine. Joe opened the door, listened for exactly 30 seconds, then shook his head. "No," he said simply. "You made your choice. Live with it." Her face crumpled, but Joe didn't waver. He closed the door, locked it, and walked away without a flicker of regret. 9 years had passed since then. Joe was 36 now, and if you asked him, he'd tell you he wasn't bitter, just pragmatic. Love was a gamble and he'd cashed out early. His life was small by design. A modest apartment, a steady job in logistics, evenings spent with books or woodworking projects that didn't talk back or demand emotional labor. Some people called him lonely. Joe called it peaceful. Except for his mother. "Joseph Thompson," she said every Thanksgiving like it was a battle cry. "You are not spending another Christmas alone." Joe speared a piece of turkey, keeping his expression neutral. "I'm fine, Mom." "You're not fine," she snapped, passing him the gravy boat like it was ammunition. "You're 36. You need companionship." "I have companionship," Joe said dryly. "Netflix. My toolbox." His sister snorted into her wine. "You're a hermit." "Happy hermit," Joe corrected. His mother's eyes narrowed, the kind of look that had once frozen him in place as a teenager sneaking in past curfew. "If you don't agree to one blind date, Joseph, I swear I will ban you from Christmas." Joe blinked. "You're threatening me with holiday exile?" "Try me," she said, her tone fierce enough to make the cranberry sauce tremble. Joe sighed, setting down his fork. "Fine. 1 date." Her smile was triumphant like a general winning a war. "You'll thank me." Joe doubted that, but he nodded anyway because the alternative was spending Christmas alone, and for reasons he didn't care to examine, that suddenly sounded worse than usual. Chapter 2, The Ultimatum. Joe Thompson had never feared his mother. Not really, but the look she gave him across the Thanksgiving table could have frozen lava. It was the kind of look that said resistance was futile, and Joe, pragmatic as ever, knew when to surrender. 1 date, he repeated, stabbing a piece of turkey like it had personally betrayed him. "That's it." His mother's smile was pure victory. "That's all I'm asking." His sister, Megan, smirked over her wine glass. "You're going to hate every second." Joe shot her a glare. "Thank you for the vote of confidence." "Just saying," Megan replied, swirling her wine like a villain in a soap opera. "You haven't been on a date in, 9 years? You're practically feral." Joe set down his fork with exaggerated care. "I'm not feral. You talk to your plants," Megan said. "They're alive," Joe countered. "They need encouragement." His mother waved a hand, dismissing the entire exchange. "Enough. You're meeting her next Saturday, noon, at Cafe Luna." Joe frowned. "You already set it up?" "Of course," she said, her tone breezy. Like arranging her son's love life was no more complicated than ordering a pie. "She's lovely, smart, wears a red knit cap." Joe blinked. "That's oddly specific." His mother shrugged. "She likes hats." Joe rubbed a hand over his face. "What's her name?" "You'll find out," she said, eyes twinkling with mischief. "Mystery adds excitement." Joe groaned. "Mom." "Joseph," she said, her voice dropping into that tone that had ended every argument since he was 5. "You promised." He sighed, defeated. "Fine." The week crawled by like a reluctant snail. Joe spent it buried in work, trying not to think about the impending social experiment his mother had orchestrated. He wasn't against dating, at least not in theory, but the idea of sitting across from a stranger and pretending to be charming felt like volunteering for dental surgery without anesthesia. By Friday night, he'd almost talked himself out of it. Almost. Then his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. Remember, Saturday, noon, Café Luna, or something nice. Joe stared at the message, then typed back, define nice. Her reply was instant, not flannel. Joe scowled at his closet, which was approximately 80% flannel. He settled on a navy sweater and dark jeans, neutral, safe, unlikely to offend anyone's sense of style. Saturday morning dawned gray and cold, the kind of day that made staying home with coffee and a book feel like a religious experience. Joe considered bailing, just for a second, but the mental image of his mother's disappointed face was enough to shove him out the door. He scribbled the address on a sticky note, shoved it in his pocket, and drove across town, muttering under his breath about the absurdity of blind dates. By the time he parked, his mood was somewhere between resigned and mildly homicidal. He checked the note, glanced around, and spotted a coffee shop across the street. Warm light spilled from its windows, and a chalkboard sign promised seasonal lattes and fresh pastries. Close enough, Joe thought. He crossed the street, pushed open the door, and stepped into a world of cinnamon and soft jazz. The place was cozy. Brick walls, mismatched chairs, the hum of quiet conversation. Joe scanned the room, looking for a woman in a dark sweater and a red knit cap. His mother's description had been vague, but it was all he had. And then he saw her, sitting alone at a window table, a paperback book in her hands, a red cap snug over chestnut hair, dark sweater, check, red hat, check. She looked peaceful, like someone who belonged in a coffee shop on a winter morning. Joe felt something shift in his chest, a flicker of curiosity he hadn't felt in years. He walked over, heart thudding like it had forgotten how to behave. Hi, he said, his voice steady enough to pass for confident. I'm Joe. I was told to meet you. She looked up, her eyes a warm hazel that caught the light like amber. For a beat, she just stared, then nodded slowly, setting her book aside. Right, she said, her voice soft, carrying a note of amusement he couldn't quite place. You're here. Joe smiled, awkward but genuine. Here. She gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. He did, feeling oddly like he'd stepped into a scene he didn't know the lines for. But when she smiled, really smiled, something in him unclenched. And just like that, the date began. 2 hours later, Joe was laughing at a story about her disastrous attempt to bake gingerbread last Christmas, and the world outside the window had blurred into falling snow. He didn't notice the time passing. He didn't notice the subtle glances from a man at the counter or the way the woman across from him seemed amused by more than just their conversation. All Joe knew was this: for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the past. He wasn't bracing for disappointment. He was here in this moment with a stranger who felt oddly familiar. And he had no idea that nothing about this meeting was what he thought it was. Chapter 3: Wrong place, right person. Joe Thompson had never been good at first dates. He wasn't awkward, at least not in the catastrophic way movies like to portray, but he wasn't smooth either. His conversational style was practical, like his life. No fluff, no unnecessary detours. Which was why, sitting across from a woman in a red knit cap at a cozy coffee shop, he was surprised to find himself enjoying this. Her name, as it turned out, was Clara. She'd offered it casually after he introduced himself, like they were picking up a conversation they'd started yesterday. No hesitation, no awkward pause, just a smile that made the gray day outside feel less bleak. So, Clara said, stirring her latte with a slow, thoughtful motion. What do you do when you're not braving blind dates? Joe chuckled, the sound rusty from lack of use. Work, sleep, occasionally yell at my toolbox. Her brows lifted, amused. Yell at your toolbox? Therapeutic, Joe said, deadpan. Better than yelling at people. Clara laughed, a warm, easy sound that curled around him like steam rising from his coffee. Fair point. What kind of work? Logistics, Joe replied. Moving things from point A to point B without chaos. Sounds organized, she said, her tone teasing but not unkind. That's the goal, Joe said. Chaos is overrated. Clara smiled, her hazel eyes glinting with something he couldn't quite read. You'd hate my life then. Why's that? She hesitated, then shrugged. Let's just say it's unpredictable. Joe tilted his head, curious. Unpredictable how? Before she could answer, a man at the counter waved at her. A quick, subtle gesture that she returned with a nod so small Joe almost missed it. He frowned but let it go. People knew people, not his business. The conversation flowed like water. Easy, unforced. They talked about books. She loved mysteries. He leaned toward biographies. Music, she confessed a guilty pleasure for 90s pop. He admitted to classic rock. And Christmas traditions. That last topic made Joe stiffen. But Clara didn't press when he deflected with a vague comment about keeping it simple. 2 hours slipped by like minutes. Joe found himself laughing at her story about a disastrous gingerbread house attempt. And when she laughed back, head tilted, eyes bright, something in his chest loosened. He hadn't felt this in years. Not since before the divorce. Not since before everything went sideways. When Clara excused herself to grab another coffee, Joe leaned back in his chair, letting the hum of the cafe wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't counting the minutes until he could leave. He wasn't bracing for disappointment. He was content. What Joe didn't notice, what he couldn't possibly know, was the quiet flurry of activity behind the scenes. The man at the counter wasn't a random customer. He was the assistant director of a small indie film crew, currently texting the producer, "He's here. Not sure why he's improvising, but it's gold." Across the room, a woman with a camera disguised as a laptop angled the lens just so, capturing every moment of Joe's earnest smile, every flicker of Clara's amusement. To them, this wasn't a blind date. It was a scene, a pivotal moment in their holiday film about a lonely woman finding unexpected connection at Christmas. And Joe? Joe was nailing it. Natural, unscripted, perfect. The only problem? He wasn't the actor they'd hired. Clara returned with her coffee, sliding back into her seat with a smile that felt different, softer, almost guilty. Joe didn't notice. He was too busy wondering if he should ask to see her again, a thought that startled him with its boldness. "So," he said, clearing his throat, "would you want to do this again?" Clara blinked, then smiled, a slow, careful curve of her lips. "I'd like that." Joe felt something warm bloom in his chest, a quiet spark he hadn't expected. He smiled back, and for a moment, the world outside the window, gray skies, falling snow, felt like the backdrop to something new, something good. When Joe finally left the cafe, scarf snug around his neck and a number saved in his phone, he had no idea he just walked out of a movie set. No idea that the woman he'd spent 2 hours laughing with wasn't his blind date at all. And absolutely no idea that his life was about to get very, very complicated. Chapter 4 Sparks and Scripts. Joe Thompson walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than he had in years. The air was sharp with winter, snowflakes drifting like lazy confetti. But for once, the cold didn't bother him. He had Clara's number saved in his phone, a simple string of digits that felt like a door cracked open after years of being locked. He didn't notice the man at the counter watching him leave, phone pressed to his ear. "Yeah," the man murmured, eyes tracking Joe through the frosted glass. "He's gone. And no, I still don't know who he is. But listen, he's perfect. Natural. Like he was born for this." Pause, then a laugh. "No, I'm not telling him yet. Why ruin the magic?" Inside the cafe, Clara sat with her hands wrapped around her coffee cup, staring at the swirl of foam like it held answers. She'd agreed to see him again, because how could she not? Joe was different. No pretense, no polished lines, just quiet humor and a steadiness that felt rare. But he wasn't supposed to be here. She glanced toward the corner where the assistant director was packing up equipment disguised as laptops. He caught her eye and grinned. "That was gold," he whispered. "Seriously, we couldn't have scripted it better." Clara managed to smile, though guilt was already curling in her stomach. This was supposed to be a scene, a simple meet-cute for an indie holiday film about a lonely woman finding connection at Christmas. The actor they'd hired had bailed last minute, and then Joe walked in like fate had a sense of humor. And now she was tangled in something that wasn't in the script. Joe spent the rest of the day in a strange haze, half disbelief, half cautious hope. He'd gone into the cafe expecting awkward small talk and an exit strategy. Instead, he'd found Clara. Warm, funny, easy to talk to. He even caught himself smiling in the car, which felt like a minor miracle. When his phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "So, how was it?" Joe stared at the screen for a long moment before typing back. "Good, really good." Her reply was instant. "I told you so." Joe chuckled, shaking his head. For once, he didn't mind her being right. 2 days later, Clara texted him. "Coffee again? Same place? Wednesday." Joe stared at the message, pulse ticking faster than he liked to admit. He typed back, "Sounds good. Noon?" Her reply came with a smiley face that felt oddly intimate. "Perfect." Wednesday arrived with a sky the color of pewter and snow dusting the sidewalks like powdered sugar. Joe walked into the cafe, scanning for Clara, and there she was, same window seat, same red knit cap. He felt something warm settle in his chest, a quiet anticipation he hadn't felt in years. "Hey," he said, sliding into the chair across from her. "Hey," she echoed, her smile bright but nervous. Joe frowned but let it go. First dates were weird. Second ones could be weirder. They ordered coffee, and the conversation picked up where it had left off. Books, music, the merits of real Christmas trees versus artificial. Joe argued for practicality. Clara championed tradition with a passion that made him laugh. "You can't fake the smell of pine," she said, eyes dancing. "You can," Joe countered. "It's called an air freshener." Clara laughed, the sound warm enough to melt frost. "You're impossible." Joe grinned. Efficient. What Joe didn't notice, again, was the subtle choreography happening around them. The man at the counter was back, pretending to read a newspaper while signaling to the woman with the disguised camera. Another crew member adjusted a microphone hidden in a potted plant. To them, this wasn't a date. It was a reshoot, a chance to capture more of Joe's unfiltered charm. And he delivered. Every dry quip, every flicker of vulnerability when Clara teased him about being a holiday Grinch was cinematic gold. Halfway through the date, Clara excused herself to grab napkins. Though what she really needed was air, she stepped into the hallway, pressing her back against the wall, her breath coming faster than it should. This was wrong. She should tell him. She should explain that their conversations were being filmed, that he wasn't just talking to her. He was starring in a movie he didn't know existed. But then she thought about the way he smiled when she laughed, the way his eyes softened when she talked about her favorite Christmas memory. He wasn't performing. He was just being Joe. And that was the problem, because Clara wasn't acting anymore either. When she returned, Joe looked up, his expression easy. "Everything okay?" Clara nodded, forcing a smile. "Perfect." But inside, nothing felt perfect at all. By the time Joe left, scarf snug around his neck and a promise to text her later, Clara knew two things. One, she liked him more than she should. And two, if this kept going, the truth was going to blow up in her face like a Christmas tree wired by amateurs. Chapter 5, The Reveal. Joe Thompson had never been the kind of man to overthink a good thing. If something worked, he let it work. No tinkering, no unnecessary adjustments. But as he walked into the coffee shop for his third meeting with Clara, something felt off. Not with her. She was there, same red knit cap, same warm smile that made the gray December day feel less bleak. No, the off part was the atmosphere. The cafe was busier than usual, but not in the normal way. People lingered near tables without drinks, fiddling with laptops that didn't seem to be turned on. A man at the counter kept glancing toward them like he was waiting for a cue. Joe brushed it off. City people were weird. He slid into the chair across from Clara, offering a smile that felt easier than it had in years. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she echoed, her smile bright but tight around the edges. Nervous again. Joe noticed it this time. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. Joe frowned but let it go. He wasn't here to interrogate her. He was here because, against all odds, he liked being here. They ordered coffee, and the conversation started like before. Books, music, holiday traditions. Clara teased him about being a Christmas minimalist, and Joe countered with a dry quip about tinsel being a gateway drug to chaos. She laughed, but it sounded strained. Halfway through, Joe excused himself to grab napkins. As he passed the counter, he caught a glimpse of something that made him stop cold. A laptop screen, open, and on it, a live feed of him and Clara, framed perfectly in the glow of the cafe lights. Joe froze, his pulse thudding like a drum. He stared at the screen, then at the man hunched over it, who quickly angled it away with a guilty flick of his wrist. "What the hell is that?" Joe asked, his voice low but sharp. The man blinked, mouth opening and closing like a fish. Nothing. Just security." "Security doesn't look like a movie set," Joe snapped, his gaze sweeping the room. The laptops, the weird lingering, the way Clara had been nervous, like she was sitting on a secret. And then it hit him, hard. He turned back to Clara, who was watching him with wide eyes, her coffee cup trembling slightly in her hands. "Clara," Joe said, his voice tight. "What's going on?" She swallowed, color draining from her cheeks. "Joe, I can explain." "Explain what?" His tone sharpened. "That I've been sitting in a damn film shoot for the past 2 weeks?" The cafe went silent. Even the jazz music seemed to pause. Clara stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "Please, just let me explain." Joe laughed, a short, bitter sound that tasted like ash. "You've got 30 seconds. Clara's words tumbled out in a rush. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. We were filming a scene, a meet-cute for a holiday movie. The actor bailed, and then you walked in, and you were perfect. You were real. And I didn't stop it because—" She broke off, her breath hitching. "Because I liked you." Joe stared at her, the weight of her confession slamming into him like a punch. "You liked me," he repeated, his voice flat. "So you lied to me." "I didn't lie," Clara said quickly. "I just didn't tell you." Joe shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "You didn't tell me because you knew I'd walk out." Her silence was answer enough. Joe felt the old walls slamming back into place, the ones he'd started to lower without even realizing it. Betrayal had a taste, and he knew it well. He'd tasted it 9 years ago at a kitchen table, and now it was back for seconds. "You know what?" he said, his voice low, steady. "Congratulations. You got your scene." "Joe!" He held up a hand, cutting her off. "Don't. Just don't." And then he turned and walked out, the cold December air hitting him like a slap. Behind him, Clara stood frozen, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with something that looked like regret. But Joe didn't look back. Outside, the city buzzed with holiday cheer. Twinkling lights, carols drifting from storefronts, couples laughing as they carried bags of gifts. Joe shoved his hands into his pockets, his jaw tight, his chest burning with something he didn't want to name. He'd been a fool. Again. He'd let himself believe, just for a second, that maybe things could be different. That maybe trust wasn't a loaded gun. And now he knew better. Chapter 6, The Grand Gesture, or something like it. Clara Lowry had never been good at damage control. She was great at improvisation. Years of indie film work had taught her how to turn disasters into quirky plot twists. But this wasn't a script. This was real. And Joe Thompson wasn't just a scene partner. He was the man who'd walked out of that cafe with betrayal carved into his shoulders. She'd watched him leave, her chest tight, her throat burning with words she couldn't make him hear. Now, 2 days later, she was pacing her apartment, staring at a string of Christmas lights she'd hung in a burst of optimism that now felt laughable. "You screwed up," she muttered, tugging at the red knit cap still sitting on her head like a guilty crown. "Big time." Her phone buzzed with a text from the assistant director. "We need him back." That scene was gold. "Any luck?" Clara stared at the message, then typed back. "This isn't about the movie anymore." She didn't hit send. Instead, she tossed the phone onto the couch and grabbed her coat. If she was going to fix this, she couldn't do it with texts or apologies that sounded like excuses. She needed something bigger. Something that said, "I didn't just use you for a scene. Care." Which was how Clara found herself standing outside Joe's apartment building an hour later, clutching a cardboard box filled with, well, chaos. Inside the box, a miniature Christmas tree, because he'd admitted he didn't decorate, a string of lights shaped like tiny snowflakes, a thermos of hot cocoa, and, because she couldn't resist, a gingerbread kit with a note that read, "For redemption purposes only." She stared at the box, then at the door, then at the box again. "This is insane," she whispered. "He's going to think you've lost your mind." But she knocked anyway. Joe opened the door wearing a navy sweater and an expression that could have frozen lava. His eyes flicked to the box, then back to her face. "Clara," he said flatly, "what are you doing here?" She swallowed hard. "Trying to fix what I broke." Joe leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his posture radiating skepticism. "With arts and crafts?" Clara glanced at the box, then back at him. "And Coco." His brow arched. "That's your grand gesture?" "No," she said quickly. "The gesture is me standing here, admitting I screwed up. The box is a prop." Joe stared at her for a long moment, his silence heavy enough to make her knees wobble. Finally, he stepped back. "You've got 5 minutes." Clara exhaled, relief flooding her chest. She stepped inside, setting the box on the counter like it was an offering to a very grumpy deity. The apartment was exactly what she'd imagined. Minimalist, neat, almost sterile. No garlands, no lights, no hint of holiday cheer. Just clean lines and muted colors, like someone had scrubbed the personality out of the place. Clara turned to him, her voice soft. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Joe's jaw tightened. "You didn't just hurt me. You made me feel like a joke." Clara flinched. "I know, and I'm sorry. I should have told you the truth from the start." "Why didn't you?" His tone wasn't sharp now, just tired, like he'd run out of anger and was left with something heavier. Clara hesitated, then said the only thing that mattered. "Because I liked you. From the moment you walked in, I liked you. And I was afraid that if I told you, you'd walk out before I got to know you." Joe stared at her, his expression unreadable. "So you let me believe it was real." "It was real," Clara said fiercely. "For me, it was real. Every laugh, every conversation. I wasn't acting." Silence stretched between them, thick and fragile. Clara's heart pounded like a drum, her fingers curling against her sides. Finally, Joe spoke, his voice low. "You know what my ex-wife taught me?" Clara swallowed. "What?" "That trust isn't a renewable resource," he said quietly. "Once it's gone, it's gone." Her throat tightened. "I'm not asking you to trust me right now. I'm asking you to let me earn it." Joe looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers like he was trying to find something worth holding on to. Then slowly he exhaled. "You've got one chance," he said. "Don't waste it." Clara's breath hitched, hope sparking like a match in the dark. "I won't." 10 minutes later, Joe was standing in his kitchen, reluctantly stringing snowflake lights while Clara assembled a gingerbread house with the precision of a bomb technician. It was awkward, messy, and absurd, and when Joe muttered something about structural integrity, and Clara burst out laughing, the tension cracked just enough to let warmth seep in. For the first time since that disastrous reveal, Joe felt the faintest flicker of something he thought he'd buried for good. Possibility. Chapter 7 Christmas Chaos. Joe Thompson had agreed to one chance. One. He wasn't sure what that meant exactly. Coffee? Another awkward apology? Maybe a gingerbread house that didn't collapse like a bad business plan? What he hadn't expected was Clara texting him 2 days later with, "Come to the studio tomorrow, noon. Trust me." Joe stared at the message like it was written in hieroglyphics. Studio? He wasn't an actor. He wasn't even comfortable in front of a camera phone. But something in those 2 words, "trust me," made him pause. Against all logic, he typed back, "Fine." The studio was tucked into a converted warehouse downtown, all exposed brick and strings of Edison bulbs that tried too hard to look casual. Joe stepped inside and immediately felt like he'd wandered into a parallel universe. Christmas exploded everywhere. Garlands draped over doorways, fake snow dusting the floor, a tree so big it looked like it had ambitions of world domination, and people, everywhere, lugging cameras, adjusting lights, shouting things like, "Scene 6, and where's the cocoa prop?" Joe froze in the doorway, his pulse ticking like a metronome. "Clara," he muttered under his breath. "What the hell did you drag me into?" She appeared like a Christmas miracle, or maybe a mischievous elf, wearing jeans, a cozy sweater, and that damn red knit cap that had started to feel like her signature. Her smile was bright, but her eyes held a flicker of nerves. "You came," she said, sounding almost surprised. "You said trust you," Joe replied, his tone dry, still waiting for the part where that makes sense. Clara winced. "Okay, fair. But hear me out." Joe crossed his arms. "This should be good." She led him to a corner where a small table was set up with mugs of cocoa and a plate of cookies that looked suspiciously staged. "We're filming the last holiday montage today," she explained, her voice quick, like she was trying to outrun his skepticism. "It's kind of a tradition for the crew. Everyone gets involved." Joe stared at her. "You want me in your movie?" Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Not as an actor, just as you, hanging out, drinking cocoa, being part of something fun." Joe's brow arched. "Fun. Yes," she said, her smile softening. "No scripts, no pressure, just Christmas chaos." Joe looked around, the lights, the laughter, the crew buzzing like caffeinated bees, and felt his chest tighten. This wasn't his world. His world was quiet, controlled, predictable. This was noise and color and unpredictability wrapped in tinsel. But then Clara touched his arm, light and tentative, and said, "Please." And damn it, Joe was a sucker for sincerity. 10 minutes later, he was wearing an apron that said Cookie King and holding a piping bag like a weapon. Clara stood beside him, grinning like she'd just pulled off the heist of the century. "This is ridiculous," Joe muttered, squeezing frosting onto a gingerbread roof. "Ridiculously festive," Clara corrected, her hazel eyes dancing. Around them, the crew filmed snippets of laughter and clinking mugs, but Joe barely noticed. He was too busy trying to keep his cookie house from collapsing while Clara sabotaged hers with an avalanche of sprinkles. "You're terrible at this," he said, smirking. "Artistic interpretation," she shot back, flicking a sprinkle at him. Joe chuckled. A real laugh, warm and unguarded. And for a moment, the noise and chaos faded. It was just him and Clara, shoulder to shoulder, frosting everywhere, and something in his chest loosening like a knot finally coming undone. Later, when the montage wrapped and the crew cheered, Clara pulled Joe aside. Her expression was softer now, stripped of the playful bravado. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for coming, for not walking away." Joe studied her, the sincerity in her eyes, the way her voice trembled just enough to sound real. He wanted to say something sharp, something that reminded her he wasn't easy to win back. But instead, he heard himself say, "Don't make me regret it." Clara's smile was slow, tender. "I won't." And for the first time since the reveal, Joe believed her. Just a little. Chapter 8, Snowfall and Second Chances. The world outside the studio had transformed overnight. Snow blanketed the streets in a hush of white, softening the edges of the city and turning even the ugliest corners into something close to magical. Joe Thompson stood at the curb, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, watching his breath curl into the cold air like smoke. He wasn't sure why he'd agreed to this. Clara had texted him late last night. "Outdoor shoot tomorrow. Come if you want. No pressure." He'd stared at the message for a long time, weighing the risk against the pull he couldn't seem to shake. In the end, he'd typed back one word, "Okay." Now he was here, boots crunching against snow, heart thudding like it had forgotten how to behave. The park was alive with holiday chaos, strings of lights draped over bare trees, vendors selling cocoa from steaming carts, kids shrieking as they launched snowballs with the precision of trained assassins. In the middle of it all, Clara stood near a lamppost wrapped in garland, her breath misting in the cold, her red knit cap bright against the winter gray. She spotted him instantly, her smile blooming like sunlight breaking through clouds. "You came." Joe shrugged, trying for casual and failing miserably. "You said no pressure. And yet," she teased, stepping closer, "here you are." Her voice was warm, but her eyes held something deeper, something that made Joe's chest tighten. He wanted to ask what she was thinking, wanted to peel back the layers of silence between them. But before he could, a man with a headset appeared like a caffeinated elf. "Clara, we're ready for the snow scene." Clara nodded, then turned to Joe, her expression apologetic. "It's just a quick shot. You can watch or join." Joe arched a brow. "Join," she grinned. "Ever built a snowman on camera?" Joe snorted. "Can't say I have. First time for everything," she said, her tone light but her gaze steady. Like this was about more than snowmen. 5 minutes later, Joe was standing in a clearing, snow crunching under his boots, while Clara rolled a lopsided snowball with the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. The crew hovered at a distance, cameras angled, but Joe barely noticed. His focus was on Clara, her laughter spilling into the cold air, her cheeks flushed pink, her hair escaping from beneath that damn red cap. "You're terrible at this," Joe said, smirking as her snowball crumbled in her hands. "Artistic interpretation," she shot back, grinning. "Besides, yours looks like a sad potato." Joe chuckled, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. And for a moment, the weight he'd been carrying for years felt lighter. He wasn't thinking about betrayal or trust or the walls he'd built so high no one could climb them. He was just here, in the snow, with a woman who made the world feel less sharp. When the cameras finally stopped rolling and the crew scattered to pack up equipment, Clara walked over, brushing snow from her gloves. Her smile was softer now, stripped of the playful bravado. "Thanks for doing this," she said quietly. "I know it's not your thing." Joe studied her, the sincerity in her eyes, the way her voice trembled just enough to sound real. "Why does it matter so much?" he asked, his tone gentle but edged with curiosity. "The movie, the chaos, all of it." Clara hesitated, then exhaled, her breath curling into the cold like a confession. "Because it's not just a movie for me, it's a second chance. I've spent years chasing stories about love and hope because I wasn't sure I believed in them anymore. And then you walked in, and suddenly," she broke off, shaking her head. "Suddenly, I wanted it to be real." Joe's chest tightened, his pulse thudding like a drum. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. So he did the only thing that felt right. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "Clara," he said softly, "I don't know how to do this." Her eyes shimmered, bright as the snow around them. "Then let's figure it out together." And before Joe could second-guess himself, he kissed her, slow, tentative, like a man testing the strength of ice after years of standing on solid ground. The world narrowed to the warmth of her lips, the steady beat of her heart against his, and the snow falling in lazy spirals like confetti from the sky. For the first time in years, Joe didn't feel like a man bracing for impact. He felt like a man coming home. Chapter 9, Christmas Eve Magic. The studio had been transformed into a winter wonderland. Strings of lights draped across rafters, garlands wound around beams, and a towering Christmas tree glittered in the corner like it had swallowed a galaxy. The scent of cinnamon and pine mingled with the hum of carols playing softly from hidden speakers. It was warm, bright, alive, the kind of place Joe Thompson had spent years avoiding. And yet, here he was. Clara stood near the tree, her red knit cap replaced by a soft green scarf that made her eyes look like spring breaking through snow. She was laughing at something the assistant director said, her cheeks flushed, her smile easy. Joe watched her from across the room, his chest tightening with something he didn't want to name but couldn't ignore. He'd kissed her yesterday, out in the snow, with cameras rolling and the world narrowing to the warmth of her lips. It hadn't felt like a scene. It had felt like a beginning, and that terrified him more than anything. "Joe!" Clara's voice cut through his thoughts, bright and warm. She waved him over, her smile blooming like sunlight. "Come help me with this." He crossed the room, weaving through crew members juggling props and mugs of cocoa. "Help with what?" She held up a box of ornaments, her grin mischievous. "Tree duty. You can't just stand there looking broody. It's Christmas Eve." Joe smirked. "Broody. Very broody," she teased, handing him a silver ornament shaped like a snowflake. "Here, make yourself useful." He took the ornament, his fingers brushing hers, and felt that now familiar spark, quiet but undeniable. He hung it on a branch, stepping back to admire the glow of lights against polished glass. "You're good at this," Clara said softly, her voice losing its playful edge. Joe glanced at her. "It's just an ornament." Her eyes held his, steady and warm. "It's more than that." Dinner was a blur of laughter and clinking glasses. The crew had gone all out. Roast turkey, mashed potatoes, pies that looked like they belonged in glossy magazines. Joe sat at the end of the table, listening to stories and jokes, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Belonging. It was loud, chaotic, imperfect, and somehow it felt right. After dessert, someone cranked up the music, and suddenly there was dancing. Clara tugged Joe into the swirl of lights and laughter, her hands warm against his. He protested at first, half-hearted, grumbling about rhythm and dignity. But when she laughed and spun him under a string of twinkling bulbs, he gave in. For a moment, the world was just her. The curve of her smile, the sound of her laughter, the way her eyes shimmered like stars caught in snow. And Joe realized something with startling clarity. He didn't want to go back to the quiet life he'd built like a fortress. He didn't want walls anymore. Later, when the music softened and the others drifted toward the fire, Joe and Clara found themselves standing beneath a sprig of mistletoe. Courtesy of Hope, the assistant director with a flair for drama. Clara glanced up, then back at him, her smile teasing. "Looks like we're in the danger zone." Joe chuckled, his voice low. "Guess we should honor tradition." He kissed her. Slow. Sure. Like a man who'd finally stopped running. The world faded to the warmth of her lips, the steady beat of her heart, and the glow of lights painting halos across the room. When they broke apart, her forehead rested against his, her breath warm against his skin. "Merry Christmas, Joe," she whispered. For a moment he couldn't speak. Then, with a voice roughened by something he hadn't felt in years, he said, "Merry Christmas, Clara." And for the first time since that kitchen table 9 years ago, the words didn't taste like ash. They tasted like hope. Chapter 10 Under the Stars. The night had settled over the city like a velvet curtain, stitched with stars that glittered against the inky sky. The studio was quiet now. Crew gone, lights dimmed, the hum of carols replaced by the soft crackle of a fire in the corner. Joe Thompson stood on the balcony just outside the loft, hands gripping the railing, breath curling into the cold air. He needed space. After hours of laughter, dancing, and mistletoe kisses, his chest felt tight, not with regret, but with something heavier, something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Behind him, the door creaked open. Clara stepped out, wrapped in a blanket, her cheeks pink from the firelight. She didn't speak at first, just moved to stand beside him, her shoulder brushing his. The silence stretched, soft and fragile, filled with the distant sound of carols drifting from a nearby street. "You okay?" she asked finally, her voice gentle. Joe stared at the stars, words clawing their way up. "I don't know." Clara waited, patient, like she understood that some truths needed time to surface. "I haven't." He broke off, jaw tightening. "I haven't done this in a long time." "Family stuff?" she guessed softly. He nodded, throat tight. 9 years ago, Christmas was the day everything fell apart. My marriage, my trust. I walked away from all of it. Family, friends, everything. I thought if I kept my world small, I'd be safe. Clara's breath hitched, but she didn't interrupt. Her hand found his, warm against the cold metal of the railing. "I told myself I was fine," Joe continued, his voice low, "that I didn't need anyone. And then you." He shook his head, a humorless laugh escaping. "You show up with your chaos and your cameras and your damn red hat. And suddenly I'm standing here wondering if I've been wrong about everything." Clara's fingers tightened around his. "You weren't wrong to protect yourself," she said softly. "But you're allowed to start again." Joe turned to her then, really turned, and saw the truth shimmering in her eyes. Not pity, not judgment, just quiet strength and something that looked dangerously like love. "I want to," he whispered, the words tasting like confession. "I just don't know how." Clara smiled, slow and tender, like sunrise breaking over snow. "Then let's figure it out together." And before Joe could second-guess himself, she leaned in, her lips brushing his in a kiss that felt like a promise, soft, steady, unhurried. The world narrowed to the warmth of her mouth, the steady beat of her heart, and the stars scattered above them like blessings. For the first time in 9 years, Joe didn't feel like a man bracing for impact. He felt like a man letting go. Chapter 11, Christmas Morning. The first light of Christmas morning spilled through the loft windows in soft gold, brushing against garlands and twinkling lights like a quiet blessing. The studio was hushed now, stripped of the chaos that had filled it hours before. No crew, no cameras, just the lingering scent of pine and cinnamon, and the faint crackle of a fire that had burned low overnight. Joe Thompson stirred on the couch, blinking against the glow. He wasn't sure what had woken him. The warmth of the blanket draped over his shoulders, the distant hum of carols from a speaker someone had forgotten to turn off, or the soft sound of footsteps padding across the hardwood floor. Clara. She appeared from the kitchen carrying 2 steaming mugs, her hair loose around her shoulders, her green scarf replaced by a simple gray sweater that made her look impossibly soft against the winter light. She smiled when she saw him awake, and something in Joe's chest tightened in that now familiar way. "Morning," she said, her voice gentle, like the day itself. Joe sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. "Morning." She handed him a mug, the scent of cocoa curling into the air like a promise. "Merry Christmas." Joe stared at the mug for a beat, then at her. The words felt foreign on his tongue, rusted from years of disuse, but when he spoke, they came out steady. "Merry Christmas." Clara's smile deepened, and for a moment, the silence between them felt like the safest place in the world. They sat together on the couch, sipping cocoa while snow drifted lazily outside the windows. The tree glowed in the corner, its lights casting halos across the polished floor. It was quiet, warm, perfect, and terrifying, because Joe knew what came next. Holidays ended. Lights came down. People went back to their lives. And he wasn't sure if this, whatever this was, could survive outside the bubble of garlands and mistletoe. Clara seemed to sense it. She set her mug down, turning to face him fully. "You're thinking too hard," she said softly. Joe gave a humorless chuckle. "Bad habit. Want to share?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes held his like they weren't letting go. Joe hesitated, then exhaled. "I don't know what happens after this." Clara's brows lifted. "After Christmas?" "After all of it," Joe said, his voice low. "The lights, the chaos, the movie. You go back to your world, I go back to mine, and—" He broke off, shaking his head. "I'm not good at temporary." Clara's gaze softened, her fingers brushing his like a whisper. "Neither am I." Joe looked at her, really looked, and saw the truth shimmering in her eyes, steady, unflinching. "So what are we saying?" Clara smiled, slow and tender, like sunrise breaking over snow. "We're saying we don't have to let it end." They spent the rest of the morning in a quiet rhythm, hanging the last ornaments, sharing stories about childhood Christmases, laughing over Clara's confession that she once tried to glue glitter to a cat. It was easy, unforced, the kind of simplicity Joe had forgotten existed. And when Clara leaned against him on the couch, her head resting lightly on his shoulder, Joe felt something settle inside him, a truth he'd been circling for days. He didn't want to go back to the life he'd built like a fortress. He wanted this. Her. Them. Chapter 12 City Lights and Promises. The city was draped in Christmas finery. Strings of lights looping across lampposts. Shop windows glowing with garlands and glitter. The air humming with carols and laughter. Snow fell in lazy spirals, softening the edges of everything, turning even the busiest streets into something close to magical. Joe Thompson walked beside Clara, their hands brushing now and then like shy confessions. She wore that green scarf again, the one that made her eyes look like spring breaking through winter, and every time she smiled, Joe felt something inside him loosen, like a knot he'd been carrying for years finally coming undone. Cold? He asked, glancing at her as they crossed a street shimmering with reflections of holiday lights. Not with this, she said, lifting her cocoa cup in mock salute. Liquid insulation. Joe chuckled, the sound warm and unguarded. Practical. Efficient, she teased, echoing his favorite word. Her grin softened into something quieter, something that made his chest ache. Thanks for tonight. Joe frowned slightly. Tonight's not over. Her brows lifted, amused. Oh? What's next? He hesitated, then nodded toward the park ahead. A stretch of white under a canopy of lights, the fountain frozen into a sculpture of ice and shadow. Walk with me. The park was nearly empty, save for a few bundled couples and a street musician coaxing carols from a violin. Snow crunched under their boots, the air sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine from a vendor's cart. Joe stopped near the fountain, his breath misting in the glow of the lights. Clara turned to him, her expression curious. What is it? Joe stared at the frozen water, words clawing their way up. I've been thinking, he said slowly, about what happens after this. Clara's smile faltered, just slightly. After Christmas? After all of it, Joe said, his voice low. The lights, the chaos, the movie. You go back to your world, I go back to mine, and… He broke off, shaking his head. I don't want that. Her breath caught, visible in the cold. You don't. Joe met her gaze, steady now. No. I want more. I want… this. His thumb brushed her knuckles, his voice roughening. I want you. Clara's eyes shimmered, bright as the snow around them. You have me, she whispered. The words hit him like warmth after a long winter. He exhaled, something inside him unclenching for good. Then I guess I'm the luckiest man alive. They stood there for a long moment, the world narrowing to the glow of lights and the hush of falling snow. Then Joe leaned in, kissing her slow and sure, like a man who'd finally stopped running. The city hummed around them. Carols, laughter, the distant chime of bells, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was her, and the truth settling in his chest like a quiet sunrise. He wasn't bracing for impact anymore. Chapter 13 New Year, New Chapter. The mountains were hushed under a blanket of snow, the sky inked with stars that glittered like shards of ice. Inside the loft, laughter spilled from the living room where Clara's crew, now more like family, counted down the last minutes of the year. Joe stood near the window, watching the reflection of the firelight flicker against the glass, his thoughts a quiet storm. 9 years ago, he'd walked out of a house that felt like a graveyard, leaving behind everything he thought he needed. He'd sworn off holidays, family, love, anything that could break him again. And yet here he was, standing in a room full of warmth, with a woman who had cracked open the walls he'd built and let the light in. Clara appeared at his side, cheeks flushed from laughter, eyes bright as the fire behind her. You're hiding, she teased softly. Just thinking, Joe said, his voice low. Dangerous habit, she murmured, slipping her hand into his. Her fingers were warm, steady. Want to share? Joe turned to her, and for once he didn't hesitate. I thought I was done, he said quietly. Done with all of this, holidays, family, trusting people. I thought if I kept my world small, I'd be safe. Clara's gaze held his, unwavering. And now, Joe swallowed hard, the truth rising like dawn. Now I want more. I want this. His thumb brushed her knuckles, his voice roughening. I want you. Clara's smile was slow, tender, like a sunrise breaking over snow. You have me, she whispered. The words hit him like warmth after a long winter. He exhaled, something inside him unclenching for good. Then I guess I'm the luckiest man alive. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8, and the room filled with voices, laughter, anticipation. Joe pulled Clara closer, his heart pounding in rhythm with the numbers. 3, 2, 1, Happy New Year. Cheers erupted, glasses clinked, and fireworks bloomed in the distance, painting the sky in bursts of color. Joe kissed Clara as the world roared around them, a kiss that tasted like promise, like everything he thought he'd lost and found again. When they broke apart, breathless and smiling, Joe rested his forehead against hers. New year, he murmured. New chapter. Clara's eyes shimmered like the fireworks outside. Let's write it together. And for the first time in 9 years, Joe believed in forever.